Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk about the sanctions that are being applied against Russia. The leaders of the G7 recently met in Hiroshima in Japan, which is famous for being one of the sites where a nuclear bomb was detonated at the end of World War II. And one of the main focuses of this meeting was to draw up a list of additional sanctions. Now, since the war started on the 24th of February 2022, we have seen multiple rounds of sanctions introduced against Russia. We are now well into double figures, and these sanctions are having a devastating impact on the Russian economy. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that Russia posted a deficit of $48 billion for the full year of 2022. And in the first quarter of 2023, they posted another deficit of $30 billion. So cumulatively, over the last 15 months, Russia has lost around $78 billion. And for a country that has an abundance of natural resources and is a net exporter, this represents a total disaster. So in today's episode, we'll have a look at the latest round of sanctions that have been introduced by the USA, the UK and Canada. We'll talk about what's happening with gold, because Russia is one of the world's largest producers of gold and also exports a lot of gold, and as well as representing a store of value and an investment, and also being attractive for jewellery, gold these days is also used in a lot of industry and technology. We'll talk about what's happening with diamonds, because Russia is the world's largest producer of diamonds, and we're now seeing sanctions being applied against these diamond businesses. We'll have a look at what's happening with technology, because Russia, despite all of its efforts, does not have a strong technology industry and is still dependent on the import of semiconductors. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think the impact of the sanctions is having on the Russian economy and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. As I mentioned at the start of the video, the leaders of the G7 recently came together in Hiroshima in Japan to talk about the sanctions against Russia and also to talk about sanctions against China, but I can cover that in a separate video. Now, we've talked about the G7 a number of times on the channel, so here's a quick test for you. Can you name the 7 nations involved? And to give you a major clue, this photo shows the leaders of all of those countries. In fact, can you name these leaders? Well, I'll quickly run through them from left to right. On the far left of this photo is Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, France's President, Emmanuel Macron, Japan's Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, the US President Joe Biden, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. So to answer the question that I just posed to you, the 7 members of the G7 are Italy, Canada, France, Japan, USA, Germany and Great Britain. However, the European Union are also involved with the G7, but are not counted as a number, so are not the G8. Now, just as a quick piece of history, because every day's a school day on the Joe Blogs channel, the G7 was originally formed in 1976 and actually was expanded to the G8 in 2005 when Russia was added as an additional member. However, following their invasion of Crimea in 2014, they were subsequently expelled and it reverted back to being the G7. The 7 countries in the G7 account for around 50% of global net worth, somewhere in the region of $200 trillion, around 40% of GDP, but only 10% in terms of population. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Atlas VPN, and to let you know about their amazing 3-year deal whereby you can get full coverage for only $1.83 per month, including an additional 3 months extra and a no-risk 30-day money-back guarantee. If you use the internet without any form of protection, you leave yourself exposed to tracking, hacking and advertising. Using Atlas VPN protects you from all of these. Atlas VPN provides you with comprehensive security and is used by more than 6 million people worldwide. So it's fantastic news that it will protect you from hacking and tracking and data breaches. But what's also great news is that it can save you money and open up a whole new world of entertainment, because it allows you to change your location, which gives you the opportunity to get better deals and to access content that may not be available in your region. Atlas VPN is available to use on unlimited devices for 1 subscription, and Atlas VPN is currently offering an amazing 3-year deal whereby you can get full coverage for only $1.83 per month, including an additional 3 months extra and a no-risk 30-day money-back guarantee. So to purchase this exclusive Joe Blogs offer, please click in the description below. And at the recent meeting, a statement issued by the G7 leaders said further sanctions would cover exports of industrial machinery, tools and technology useful to Russia's war efforts, while efforts would also be pursued to limit Russia's revenue from trade in metals and diamonds. And this announcement follows on from the USA's recent announcement that it's added an additional 300 targets to its list of sanctioned companies and entities. And US Treasury Department Secretary Janet Yellen stated, "Today's actions will further tighten the vice on Russian President Vladimir Putin's ability to wage his barbaric invasion and will advance our global efforts to cut off Russian attempts to evade sanctions." In response to this, interestingly, Russia's foreign ministry said former US President Barack Obama was among 500 American citizens who would be banned in response to the latest round of US sanctions. So unfortunately this year, Barack and Michelle Obama are going to have to cancel their summer vacation to Moscow. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that the sanctions targeted an international network that procures components for the Russian-based entity responsible for the manufacture of the Orlan drone, which Russian forces and their proxies are using in Ukraine. The Treasury Department said it had imposed sanctions on 22 people and 104 entities with touchpoints in over 20 countries or jurisdictions, including companies that import, ship or manufacture electronics components, semiconductors and microelectronics to Russia. As part of its crackdown in recent months on Russia's evasion of sanctions, the Treasury Department designated people and entities in Switzerland, Germany, Liechtenstein and the Netherlands. The department said it was also imposing sanctions on Russia's energy educational and research institutions in a bid to limit Russia's future extractive capabilities by targeting the training grounds for Russia's future energy specialists and sites where extraction technologies are developed. The State Department also designated or blocked property of almost 200 individuals, entities, vessels and aircraft and imposed sanctions on Polyus and the Russian business of its peer Polymetal, the largest gold producers in Russia. Subsidies of Russia's state-owned nuclear energy company Rosatom were also targeted, as well as 2 Iranian shipping companies, a port operator and a maritime service provider it said were part of deepening ties between Russia and Iran. The Biden administration also halted the export of a wide range of consumer goods to Russia and added 71 companies to a Commerce Department's list that bars suppliers from selling them US technology without a hard-to-obtain license. The new curbs targeted items that can be used to help Russia's military, including items used in daily life like clothes dryers, snowplows and milking machines, which the US thinks could be repurposed to support Moscow's war machine. Washington lawyer Kevin Wolf, a former US Commerce Department official, said you can't even ship contact lenses or sunglasses now. It would be simpler to describe the items that are not controlled for export to Russia. The blacklisted companies include 69 Russian entities, 1 from Armenia and 1 from Kyrgyzstan. They were added to the Commerce Department's entity list primarily for supporting Russia's military and defence sectors, making it even harder to ship any goods to them. The targeted companies include aircraft repair and parts production plants, gunpowder, tractor and automotive factories, shipyards and engineering centres in Russia. The new rules build on controls already in place on Russia's industrial, commercial, chemical and biological sectors, adding a variety of electronics, instruments and carbon fibres, as well as chemicals including fentanyl and its precursors. Great Britain has banned the import of Russian diamonds, copper, aluminium and nickel, and announced new sanctions against Russia, targeting companies connected to the suspected theft of Ukrainian grain. Targeting entities involved in grain trading is unusual, as such activity typically comes under humanitarian exemptions. However, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office stated that this grain and other agricultural goods have been reported stolen from warehouses and fields in the temporarily occupied territories in Ukraine. Canada has also announced that it's imposing new sanctions under its Special Economic Measures regulations, including the sanctioning of 17 individuals and 18 entities linked to Russian companies that provide military technology and know-how to Russia's armed forces, as well as 30 individuals and 8 entities involved in Russia's ongoing human rights violations, including the transfer and custody of Ukrainian children in Russia. Russia is the world's 3rd largest producer of gold after China and Australia. And this chart shows the absolute levels and the breakdown of the demand for gold dating back to 2018. And the bars on this chart are split into 5 different categories. The dark blue section, which can be seen at the bottom of the Q1 2023 bar on the far right hand side, represents gold that's held by funds for investment purposes. The green section, which is by far the largest on all of these bars, is gold that's used in jewellery fabrication. The dark green section in the middle of all of these bars is gold that's used in technology. Gold is a non-corrosive metal that is a great conductor of electricity and is highly resistant to heat. It's also relatively soft and pliable and can easily be stretched or plated for very thin coatings. And for all of those reasons, gold is used in electronics, particularly for cables and connectors. The lilac section towards the top of the bars is used in the production of gold coins and gold bars. And the red section at the top of these bars represents demand directly from central banks and other institutions that are looking to buy gold for long-term investment purposes. So if we look at the breakdown of demand in the first quarter of 2023, you can see that the biggest single use of gold, representing around 47%, is the fabrication of jewellery. The next biggest usage is the production of gold bars and coins, which represents around 28%. Central bank purposes represent around 21%. And as both of these uses are basically for investment purposes, if you combine them, the majority of the purchases, 49%, are for long-term investment. The use of gold in technology is very important in terms of the production of that technology. However, in terms of global demand, it only represents around 7% of all of the gold that's produced. So the vast majority of gold that's being produced globally is being used either for store of value or for decorative purposes. As we discussed earlier in the video, both the USA and the UK have now targeted more gold producers in Russia to prevent the import of any Russian gold products. But the big question is, what impact will that have on Russia's exports? Because gold is very difficult to be able to trace. Once it's exported, it can be melted down and formed into new bars or new coins or new jewellery. And the ability to trace that back to Russian origin is very difficult. And since the start of the Ukraine war, Russia's exports to the West have fallen significantly. However, their exports to countries like India and China have risen dramatically. And unlike oil, Russian gold isn't selling at a major discount to the market prices. So the overall impact in terms of Russia's revenues from gold exports probably isn't severely affected by these new sanctions. Russia is the world's largest producer of diamonds, followed by Botswana, Canada, Democratic Republic of Congo, Australia, although their production in recent years has dropped dramatically, Angola and South Africa. And in a similar fashion to gold, the vast majority of diamond exports, in terms of value, relate directly to diamonds that are used for jewellery and decorative purposes. However, there is also a major industry worldwide in industrial diamonds, and these are diamonds that are found that do not have the same clarity and therefore are not usable in terms of decorative purposes. And in terms of the global production of industrial diamonds, Russia is also the world's largest producer, followed by the Democratic Republic of Congo, Botswana, South Africa and Zimbabwe. And as we covered earlier in the video, the G7 is now looking to target the diamond companies from Russia. But once again, the problem here is that it's very difficult to be able to identify the origin of where a diamond was actually produced. And therefore, if Russian diamonds are exported to countries like India and then used in jewellery, it will be very difficult to be able to stop that global supply. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that this is exactly what's been happening with crude oil. Since the start of the war, India and China have been buying large quantities of crude oil from Russia. They're then passing that crude oil through their refinery process to produce things like gasoline and diesel. And those products are then being sold on into the international markets. And it's very difficult to be able to identify where the crude oil originated from. So what we've seen over the course of the last 12 months is that India and China have increased their purchases of crude oil, and they've also increased their export of refined products, which are using that crude oil as their raw material. Now, as you'll be aware if you followed the channel, Russia has been facing a lot of technology sanctions since its invasion of Ukraine. However, this isn't the first round of technology sanctions that have been applied against Russia. Russia invaded Crimea back in 2014 and then subsequently annexed that whole area, and it's been deemed to be part of Russia ever since. And as a direct result of that, the USA introduced a variety of technology sanctions against Russia, and these were followed up by the EU and the UK. And these sanctions were put together predominantly to prevent Russia from being able to access AI and other microchip technology that could be used in defense systems, so weaponry and other forms of attack. And it's really interesting to note that at that time, President Putin instructed his technology guys to set up their own development systems, to build research to make these chips themselves. However, over the last 8 years, Russia has been entirely unsuccessful in being able to do that. It is still importing all of its chips. So this really gives you a flavour as to how difficult it is to be able to create this sort of technology. You might be able to get hold of some of it, and therefore you think it would be easy to replicate it. But because these things are so technologically advanced, it's not just a case of breaking it down and then copying it. You need to have the skills and the research to be able to put these things together from scratch, and Russia doesn't have that. Now, in terms of the latest round of technology sanctions, these are far more wide-ranging. So they're not just focused on defense-related chips these days, it's any form of technology. And Russia has been sanctioned entirely since the start of this war. So they're no longer able to legitimately get hold of any of the chips that they've needed historically. And this is a major problem for Russia because a lot of their oil and gas industry relies upon this form of advanced technology. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that a lot of the Russian oil and gas facilities are based in inhospitable places. They are operating in very cold climates and they have technological problems. So they need to have advanced technology to be able to get around all of this, to give them the warning systems and to be able to handle all of the different strains and stresses that those systems come under. And Russia no longer has any of that. It was reported that Russia was stockpiling some of this technology prior to its invasion of Ukraine. So it may well have a supply to see it through a certain amount of time. But the problem that Russia's facing is that it won't be able to get replacements going forward. So as and when these chips fail or they have problems, they won't be able to sort those problems out. So that will cause them an immediate problem. But the bigger issue is that they won't be able to keep moving forward. They won't be able to keep developing at the same rate as the rest of the world. And that's going to be a major problem for Russia in the longer term. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because the sanctions that are now in place against Russia are the largest and widest ranging that have ever been applied against any country. This is the biggest coordinated global effort that has ever been seen to try to get a country to desist from its war effort. The sole reason that these sanctions have been created is to stop the war, to try to persuade Russia that it's losing so much money that it needs to do something about what's happening in Ukraine. And as we saw at the start of the video, during the recent meeting in Hiroshima, another round of sanctions have been applied against Russia. And we've talked in detail in today's video about what's happening with regards to gold production, diamond production, and technology. Now, when we talk about the production of gold and diamonds, what that really means for the majority of the volume is mining of those products and then exporting that raw material to countries where those products are finished. And the problem that the G7 has is that once those Russian raw materials go to another country and then go through some form of finishing process, it's very difficult to identify exactly where those diamonds or that gold came from. So the sanctions to stop any countries in the West from purchasing directly from Russia obviously are effective. So Russia has lost all of those sales. But for things like gold and diamonds, there is global demand. People, institutions, and governments feel comfortable investing into gold and diamonds because they are valuable assets. They are limited in supply and therefore they tend to hold their value. If you look over the long term as to what's happened with the price of gold and the price of diamonds, it generally moves at or above inflation. So if you put your money into them, it's likely to retain its value. And because of those characteristics, there's always going to be demand. And therefore, countries such as India and China will take up the slack in terms of the loss of the sales to the West. And that means that Russia is likely to still be getting the revenue from the sale of those assets. So the only way really for the G7 to be able to cut off that revenue stream is for secondary sanctions to be applied against India and China. And I think realistically, the longer that this war goes on, the more focus that the G7 is going to have to put onto those secondary sanctions, persuading countries such as India and China not to make those purchases. And that is going to be a big challenge. Now, in terms of the technology sanctions, it's a completely different situation because Russia doesn't have an abundance of technology. It simply doesn't have the ability to create its own semiconductors and tech. As you saw earlier in the video, since the invasion of Crimea in 2014, Russia has desperately been trying to put together its own tech industry, but these things take a very long period of time. You need to build on all the research and development that's been happening over the last 30 or 40 years, and Russia simply doesn't have that depth of research. So it simply isn't capable of creating its own technology, and that is a major problem for a country like Russia because it's dependent on the extraction of raw materials, and a lot of those raw materials are in inhospitable areas, very cold climates, and so you need the latest tech to make sure all of your equipment is operational and efficient. And the sanctions that have been applied against Russia are focused on stopping Russia getting access to any of that technology, both for defense purposes and also for its industry. And the longer that this war goes on, the higher the risk that Russian tech will start to break down and that they won't be able to repair or replace it. And that could have catastrophic implications for industries such as oil, gas, and mining. So whilst the West is going to struggle to stop the export of gold and diamonds, there is a possibility that the failure of technology in mining could cause Russia a problem. So the overall summary of today's video is that the sanctions against Russia are continuing to increase. More and more industries and sectors are being targeted, and this means that Russia will continue to find it difficult to find more markets for its exports. But probably the biggest issue that Russia is facing is the loss of technology. At some point, Russian technology will start to fail. And if Russia is not able to replace the technology that it has, then that means that it's going to see a fall in productivity, a fall in output, and potentially could send Russia back 5 or 10 years. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it interesting, useful and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.